The Persian Gulf just became the most dangerous body of water on Earth. Right now, as you're watching this, Iranian drones are scouring the waters, hunting for America's most powerful symbol of military supremacy, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group. This isn't posturing, this isn't theater. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has publicly rejected Trump's latest deal proposal, and they've backed up those words with action. What we're witnessing is a complete breakdown of the diplomatic channel that's kept this region from exploding for the past 2 years. Think about what this means. Iran's elite military force, the same organization that orchestrated the seizure of tankers and launched precision strikes on Saudi oil facilities, is now actively tracking a U.S. aircraft carrier in waters they consider their backyard. The last time tensions escalated to this level, we were hours away from open warfare. But here's what the mainstream media won't tell you. This confrontation isn't happening in a vacuum. It's the culmination of decades of sanctions, broken agreements, and a fundamental shift in how regional powers view American military dominance. The question isn't whether conflict is possible anymore, the question is whether it's already inevitable. Let me be very clear about what's unfolding in the Persian Gulf right now, because the implications of this moment stretch far beyond a single aircraft carrier or even the immediate confrontation between Washington and Tehran. We're watching the architecture of American power in the Middle East undergo a stress test that could redefine everything we thought we understood about military deterrence, diplomatic leverage, and the actual limits of what a superpower can achieve when the world order it created begins to fracture beneath its feet. The USS Abraham Lincoln didn't just wander into these waters by accident. This is one of America's 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, a floating city of over 5,000 personnel, carrying approximately 90 aircraft, capable of projecting power across thousands of miles. When you deploy a carrier strike group to the Persian Gulf, you're not making a subtle diplomatic gesture. You're placing a loaded gun on the table and daring someone to reach for it. The carrier itself is accompanied by guided missile cruisers, destroyers, and submarines that form a defensive perimeter designed to make it essentially invulnerable to conventional attack. This is the kind of military hardware that's supposed to make adversaries think twice, back down, reconsider their options. But here's the problem. Iran stopped thinking that way years ago. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps isn't just another branch of Iran's military structure. It's a state within a state, an ideologically driven force that controls vast swaths of Iran's economy, commands its own navy, air force, and ground troops, and operates with a level of autonomy that would be unthinkable in Western military hierarchies. When the IRGC makes a decision, it's not necessarily reflecting the calculations of Iran's civilian government or even its supreme leader's immediate preferences. These are true believers who've built their entire identity around resistance to American hegemony, and they've spent 4 decades preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. They've studied every American military engagement since Desert Storm. They've analyzed the tactics, the doctrines, the technological advantages, and most importantly, the political constraints that limit how and when America can actually use its overwhelming military superiority. Trump's deal proposal, whatever its specific terms might have been, arrived at a moment when Tehran has absolutely no incentive to appear weak or conciliatory. Think about the regional context here. Iran has watched the United States withdraw from Afghanistan in chaos, struggle to maintain its position in Syria, and fail to prevent the collapse of its Kurdish allies when Turkey decided to move against them. They've seen American sanctions create hardship, yes, but not the kind of regime-changing pressure that Washington predicted. Instead, Iran has adapted, built alternative trade networks, deepened its relationships with Russia and China, and continued to extend its influence across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen through proxy forces that operate below the threshold of direct confrontation, but above the threshold of irrelevance. From Tehran's perspective, they've already survived the maximum pressure campaign. They've already endured the worst economic warfare that America could throw at them without actually invading, so why would they suddenly capitulate now? The drone deployment is particularly significant because it represents a category of military technology where Iran has actually achieved something approaching parity with far more advanced militaries. While America spends billions developing exquisite weapon systems with capabilities that exceed any realistic operational requirement, Iran has focused on cheap, producible, and tactically effective platforms that can be manufactured in large numbers and deployed without risking pilots or expensive aircraft. Iranian drones have proven themselves in Yemen, where Houthi forces used them to strike Saudi oil facilities with precision that stunned Western military analysts. They've shown up in Ukraine, where Russia has used Iranian-designed drones to devastating effect against Ukrainian infrastructure. These aren't crude, improvised weapons. They're sophisticated enough to evade many defensive systems, cheap enough to be deployed in swarms, and effective enough to accomplish their mission objectives. When the IRGC launches drones to locate the Abraham Lincoln, they're demonstrating several things simultaneously. First, they're showing that they can operate in the carrier's vicinity without being immediately shot down or deterred. Second, they're collecting real-time intelligence on the carrier's defensive posture, its escort vessels, and the patterns of its operations. Third, they're sending an unmistakable message that the presence of overwhelming American firepower doesn't intimidate them into silence or inaction. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, they're forcing the carrier strike group to operate under the assumption that it's being constantly watched, tracked, and targeted. That's psychological pressure that works in both directions. Yes, the Iranians know exactly where the carrier is, but the carrier's commanders also have to assume that every drone contact could be the precursor to a larger attack, which means they are burning through defensive munitions, keeping their crews at higher alert levels, and operating with the kind of tension that degrades effectiveness over time. Let's talk about what actually happens if this situation escalates beyond surveillance and posturing. The scenarios range from limited exchanges to full-scale regional war, and none of them end well for anyone involved. Iran cannot sink an American aircraft carrier with conventional weapons in a straightforward engagement. The defensive capabilities of a carrier strike group are simply too robust. But Iran doesn't need to sink the carrier to achieve its objectives. A successful strike that damages the carrier, kills American sailors, or even just forces it to withdraw from the Gulf would be a strategic victory that would resonate across the entire region. It would shatter the perception of American invulnerability, embolden every actor that's been waiting for signs of American weakness, and fundamentally alter the calculus of every government that's been hedging its bets between Washington and its rivals. The American response to any such attack would be overwhelming and immediate. We're talking about strikes against IRGC facilities, missile sites, naval bases, and potentially command and control infrastructure across Iran. But here's where it gets complicated. Iran has spent decades preparing for this scenario. They've hardened their most critical facilities, dispersed their assets, and built redundancy into every system that matters. More importantly, they've positioned proxy forces throughout the region that can respond to American strikes by attacking American personnel and interests in Iraq, Syria, and across the Gulf states. Hezbollah in Lebanon sits on an arsenal of over 100,000 rockets that can strike anywhere in Israel. Houthi forces in Yemen can target ships passing through the Bab al-Mandab Strait, one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. Iraqi militias can target the American embassy in Baghdad and the remaining American troops stationed throughout the country. This isn't a war that ends with a few days of airstrikes and a return to the status quo. This is a war that metastasizes into a regional conflict that draws in Israel, Saudi Arabia, and potentially Turkey, with economic consequences that ripple through global energy markets and financial systems. Oil prices would spike immediately, not just because of reduced Iranian production, but because of the risk premium that traders would place on every tanker passing through the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil passes through that 30-mile-wide waterway, and Iran has the capability to mine it, attack ships with fast boats and missiles, and generally make it too dangerous for commercial traffic to operate normally. We saw a preview of this in 2019 when tankers were attacked and seized, and oil prices jumped, even though actual supply disruptions were minimal. In a full-scale confrontation, we'd be looking at sustained disruptions that would push prices toward levels that trigger recessions in oil-importing economies and accelerate the inflation that's already straining household budgets across America and Europe. But let's zoom back out to the deeper strategic picture, because the Iran situation is really a proxy for a much larger transformation in global power dynamics. The United States has organized its foreign policy around the assumption that it can project power globally, maintain military superiority in multiple theaters simultaneously, and use that superiority to shape outcomes in its favor. That assumption worked brilliantly for about 3 decades after the Cold War ended. American carrier groups could sail anywhere without meaningful opposition. American sanctions could cut countries off from the global financial system. American diplomatic pressure could topple governments or at least constrain their options. But that world is dissolving, and what's replacing it is a multipolar system where regional powers have enough capability to resist American pressure, enough alternatives to American-dominated institutions, and enough confidence to call American bluffs. Iran is testing whether America is still willing to pay the price for maintaining its position in the Middle East, not just the financial cost, though that's certainly relevant at a time when the federal budget is drowning in deficits and debt, but the political cost of engaging in another major military conflict that the American public doesn't support and doesn't understand, the cost in American lives when casualties start coming home, the cost in global standing when American strikes inevitably kill civilians and generate the kind of images that fuel anti-American sentiment for generations. The cost in strategic bandwidth when resources committed to fighting Iran can't be used to counter China in the Pacific or support Ukraine against Russia or deal with any of the other dozen crises that are always simmering just below the boiling point. Trump's deal, whatever it contained, was almost certainly an attempt to avoid precisely this dilemma. It was probably structured around some combination of sanctions relief, security guarantees, and constraints on Iran's nuclear program and regional activities. The problem is that Iran has heard these promises before. They negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Obama, complied with its terms according to international inspectors, and then watched Trump unilaterally withdraw from the agreement and reimpose sanctions that devastated their economy. Why would they trust American commitments now? Why would they give up the leverage they've built over years of patient investment in proxy forces, missile technology, and regional relationships in exchange for promises that the next American administration could simply discard? The IRGC's rejection of the deal isn't just about the specific terms. It's a statement about credibility, about the value of negotiations with a power whose commitments aren't binding across changes in leadership. It's a recognition that Iran's position might actually be stronger now than it would be after making concessions that weaken their defensive capabilities and regional influence. From their perspective, they've already survived the worst. Sanctions didn't break them. Assassinations of their scientists and generals didn't break them. Sabotage attacks on their nuclear facilities didn't break them. So why would they voluntarily dismantle the capabilities that have kept them secure? This is the core problem with the entire American approach to Iran over the past 2 decades. Washington keeps trying to pressure Tehran into capitulation, but the pressure never quite reaches the level that would force regime change, and it always leaves Iran with enough breathing room to adapt and survive. The result is an adversary that's more hardened, more committed to resistance, and more confident that it can withstand whatever America throws at it short of full-scale invasion. An invasion is simply not an option. The American military could probably topple the Iranian government, but it couldn't pacify the country, control the territory, or prevent the kind of asymmetric warfare that turned Iraq and Afghanistan into quagmires that cost trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives while achieving few of their stated objectives. So here we are, watching Iranian drones track an American carrier, waiting to see who blinks first. The optimistic scenario is that both sides recognize the danger and pull back from the brink. The carrier completes its deployment and leaves the Gulf. Iran claims victory for standing up to American intimidation. Diplomatic channels quietly reopen. The crisis fades into the background noise of Middle Eastern tensions that never quite explode into full-scale war. But the pessimistic scenario is much more likely given the dynamics at play. A miscalculation, a technical failure, a decision made by a mid-level commander who doesn't have the full picture, any of these could trigger an exchange that escalates beyond anyone's ability to control, and once the shooting starts, both sides face immense pressure to respond forcefully rather than appear weak. Pride, honor, credibility, these things matter in international politics as much as rational calculation of costs and benefits. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that neither side has an obvious off-ramp. Trump can't simply withdraw the carrier without looking like he backed down from Iran, which would be politically devastating and strategically damaging to American credibility throughout the region. But keeping the carrier in the Gulf while Iranian drones buzz around it creates a situation where an incident becomes increasingly probable the longer the standoff continues. Iran can't stop tracking the carrier without appearing to have been intimidated by American power, which would undermine the entire narrative of resistance that justifies IRGC influence within Iranian politics. But continuing to probe the carrier's defenses increases the chances that someone makes a mistake or misinterprets an action as hostile when it wasn't intended that way. The world is holding its breath, even if most people don't realize it yet. Energy markets are watching. Defense analysts are gaming out scenarios. Diplomats are working phones trying to create space for de-escalation. But beneath all of this is a fundamental question about the nature of power in the 21st century. Can overwhelming military superiority still dictate outcomes when your adversary is willing to absorb punishment and fight asymmetrically? Can economic sanctions change behavior when the targeted country has alternatives and is willing to endure hardship? Can diplomatic pressure work when trust has been destroyed and commitments aren't credible? These are the questions that define not just the Iran crisis, but the broader challenge facing American foreign policy as the unipolar moment ends and something messier and more contested takes its place. The drones circling above the Persian Gulf aren't just looking for a carrier. They're mapping the contours of a new world order where American power still matters but no longer dominates, where regional players have agency and options, and where the rules that governed international relations for the past 30 years are being rewritten in real time through contests of will that could explode into violence at any moment.